Razvan Pascanu. Je vous présente d'abord le jury. Je suis Neil Stewart, président du jury, et Joshua Benio, qui est détective d'étudiants. Roland Savek, qui est membre du jury. Il y a aussi M. Martin Hardin du département de psychologie, qui est le représentant du doyen. Alors, je pense qu'on va procéder en anglais. Present also the candidate, Razvan Pascanu, and Ilya Sutskever, sorry, what language am I speaking? So, Ilya Sutskever is here by means of Skype. We will have a presentation of about 40 minutes, and after that there will be questions from the jury, questions from the audience, and then afterwards everyone will leave except the members of the jury who discuss the thesis.
Thank you. So thank you everyone for being here. So today I'm going to talk about some of the research that I carried out during my PhD studies. And I'll start off with a bit of motivation. So this is a funny quote by Phillis, who's a stand-up comedian, who said, "Computer once beat me at chess, but it was no match for me at kickboxing." And this is interesting because it covers one important aspect of modern definition of intelligence. So basically, intelligence has to be an expectation over all possible tasks of the performance of an agent. And in this case, our agent is really good at chess, but is not really good at kickboxing, therefore is not that intelligent. Of course, I'm not good at either, but the hope is you have to have a lot of tasks, and then things will be ordered the right way. And what this shows is that if you want to get an intelligent agent, it's kind of impossible to have rule-based approach to defining of how the agent should behave for different tasks. And that's why I think learning is useful, because learning gives you like a meta solution. So once you manage to create an agent that can learn, that agent can learn on its own to solve this many tasks. And that's my motivation of thinking that machine learning is maybe the most important component if you want to construct artificial intelligence, and artificial intelligence in itself is a meta solution to many day-to-day problems that we have. This doesn't really motivate why you should care about deep learning or recurrent neural nets, but as we'll see later on, deep models and recurrent nets, they're very efficient universal approximators, and therefore they're a very good candidate for this meta solution to learn, for learning. And that's how I got into all of this. Next, we'll go a bit defining some of some important notions of machine learning. So I'm not going to go into any detail. There are just a few slides just to get everybody on the same page. So I'll start with supervised learning, because this is kind of the focus of my work. And you can think that in supervised learning, you have a function that goes from the set of all possible parameters and the set of all possible inputs to the set of all possible outputs or wanted behaviors. And this function defines the family of models that you're going to use. And then a particular model in this family of functions is a function. It is basically you get a particular model by fixing the parameter theta. So it's a function that goes from possible inputs to possible outputs, and it can be obtained by fixing theta. And then supervised learning is the process of finding that theta that minimizes this expectation over the output of your model and the desired behavior of your model. Of course, the way it's written here, this expectation is untractable. So what we do, we approximate it by picking some samples. So we construct a training set, which is a set of inputs and desired targets. And because of this approximation, there are a lot of issues. For example, the minimum of our approximation is not necessarily the minimum of this expectation, and this is where the big difference between learning and optimization comes from. So in learning, you usually optimize some surrogate cost that you can compute, but which doesn't really behave exactly like the real thing that you want to minimize, and therefore you have to make some compromises. But in the end, it all boils down to optimization. I mean, once you fix the surrogate cost, you'll have to do optimization to basically find a minimum of this. And then there's like the optimization field is much larger than the deep learning field. I'm not gonna try to summarize it, but one way of thinking of how you could optimize such a function, if it's differentiable, is you can have this iterative process where at every time step you approximate your function by a Taylor series, either a first order one or a second order one, and then you're move towards the minimum of this approximation. And then if you do a first order Taylor expansion, that you're taking a gradient step, so a gradient descent step, and if you do a second order method, you take a second order Taylor approximation. Now of course this approximation is only true locally, and especially in our case where we have non-convex function and so on, it's sometimes useful to bound the step that you take. So, and this is the basic idea behind trust region method. So we know this approximation is only be true locally. So what we do is we're moving in this direction of the minimum of our approximation, but such that we stay within the trust region in which we believe our approximation to be good. And then there are different heuristics or ways of defining this trust region and incorporating this in what we're doing. So next, in a few words, so let's talk about the kind of functions we're trying to minimize. So in our case, these are going to be neural networks. And here we have a feed-forward network, a standard MLP. So one way of thinking of the MLP is you have a bunch of neurons. Each neuron computes a simple but nonlinear function of its inputs. In this case, the neurons are divided into layers. And each layer gets input the activation of the neurons on the layer below, and the value of each neuron is a weighted sum of the activations of the layers of the units on the layer below plus some bias. And then you apply some nonlinear function like the rectifier, which returns 0 if this sum was negative, or the value of the sum if the sum was positive. So it's just like thresholding this sum. And this basically constructs your model. In this way you construct your model. So then you go to the next layer and you kind of do the same operation and so on until you end up to the last layer, which is your output layer. Yes, and this is the standard MLP. Now, if you want to look at the standard MLP, what it does, it basically induces a connectivity graph between the units, and this graph doesn't have cycles. Now, if you allow to get cycles within the graph, what you get is a recurrent neural network. So recurrent neural network, theoretically, they're more powerful than feed-forward networks, and the basic idea is that once you have cycles in your graph, you can the model can exhibit memory. So through those cycles, you can remember information about inputs that it's seen in the past, and can make decisions on time t based on what it's seen before. And it was shown that this can convert the recurrent neural network, can approximate a Turing machine. So it can basically elevate to that level, while we know that a feed-forward network can only approximate arbitrary functions. Of course, there's a price to pay for this. Recurrent neural networks are much more difficult to train. So there's, first of all, computationally, it's much more expensive. So you cannot parallelize as easy as you could for a feed-forward network, but there's also issues with the error surface of the recurrent net. So you have these pathological events with the gradients when they can explode or vanish, and in general, learning just doesn't work that well. And now I'll start diving into the works that I've done in my thesis, and I'll start out with the work that I've done together with Guido and Kunyum and Joshua. So this is some theoretical work on trying to understand why deep neural networks are better than shallow models. So by deep neural networks, in this specific case, we mean MLPs that have more than one hidden layer. And we also restrict our models to use this rectifier activation function. So this work was, first version of this work was accepted at ITR 2014, and the refined version is now submitted at NIPS and is under review. So rectifier is the simple function which rectifier of x equals 0 if x is smaller than 0, or x if x is larger than 0, larger or equal to 0. And the idea is this is a piecewise linear function, and the idea of this work is that the composition of piecewise linear functions is a piecewise linear function itself. So then what we're going to do is we're going to use the number of linear pieces that the model can have as a measure of its flexibility or of its power. And what we're trying to show is that the number of pieces that you get for a deep model is exponentially larger than the number of pieces that you get for a shallow model, and therefore answer to the question of why would you want to use deep networks by saying that, well, they're exponentially more efficient than shallow models. So you can do a lot more with a smaller model. So it's efficiency in terms of how many training examples you need to train the model, and efficiency in terms of computation. So we first of all, we need to start with the single layer model. And what you can see is that if you look at a hidden unit of a single layer model that uses this rectifier activation, basically each hidden unit splits the space in two regions. On one side, the unit is 0. On the other one, the unit has this linear output, that f of x equals x. And there's a hyperplane that divides the space this way. And then if you ask yourself into how many regions does a single layer element P splits the space, it ends up being the same as asking the question, if I have n hyperplanes and if I throw them in a space, into how many regions can this hyperplane split the space? This is a well-studied problem in geometry, and it was actually solved by Zaleski in 1975. And he got this formula, which is the exact number in the case when the hyperplanes are in general position, which means no three hyperplanes intersect in the same point. So we have our number for the shallow model, and now what we need to do is we need to show that the deep model can do better than this. So I'm not going to present the whole proof, just the key idea of the proof. So how would you do this for a deep model? So what we're going to do is we're going to construct a specific model that has a lot more regions, and then we can use the number of linear regions that this deep model gives us as a bound for the lower bound for the maximum number of regions that you can get with the deep model. And the basic intuition is, if you have something like the absolute value, what the absolute value does is basically, if you have 4 points, if you have these 4 points in the space, then the absolute value will basically map all of them to the same thing. And if you look further in terms of regions, what this does is basically maps all the quadrants to the first quadrant. And then what you can do at the next layer, you can use negative biases to shift your activation so that you get negative numbers again, and you can apply this process again. And what you can, if you go backwards after you do all this process, what you notice is that if you partition your space in any way at the end, then this partition gets repeated in all of these regions that were folded on top of each other. So you can think of what's going on exactly like folding a piece of paper. So you take your space, and with the lower layers, what you can do is you can fold the paper in different ways, and then afterwards, whatever partition you do on this folded space, the lines that will, this partition will be repeated in all the regions that are folded on top of each other. So when you expand the input space again, you'll see this partition multiplying together. And of course, the folding doesn't have to be axis-aligned. You can fold the space in many ways. And even this metaphor of folding paper is not exactly correct, because the folding that we're talking about here doesn't need to preserve distances. So it can be very, very complicated. But if you do this, and then in order to get our model, what we can do is we can use a grid and basically fold all the cells of the grid on top of each other. And if you do that, then in the end, if you count the number of regions, you get a number that's exponential in the depth of the model. So it grows exponentially with the depth of the model, and which is much better than what a shallow model can do for the same number of weights. So for the same number of weights, the model is a lot more expressive. And the other interesting thing that you can do with this observation that a composition of piecewise linear functions, the piecewise linear function itself, it basically gives you a way into looking what a hidden unit does in an intermediary layer. So what you can do is you can pick a unit, and then you can look at the different linear responses that it has for the different linear pieces of the input space, and you can visualize each of these linear responses. So in here, we use the Toronto phase data set, and we train a deep rectifier MFP. And I think these pictures are from layer 4, which is the output layer in our case. So basically what we did is we looked at each output unit, and then we search using the training set. We search for these different linear pieces that, and then we plot the linear response. And because the input is an image, the linear response is basically the weight of this linear response is an image itself, and you can visualize it. And you can see to what kind of things this unit responds to. So this unit responds when it sees faces that when it sees faces that looks like this, so angry faces. I think these are supposed to be happy faces, and they're like very interesting transformation of the faces. Happy face that you can see here. So now moving on. So we talk about why we should use deep networks. The second question that I looked at during my studies was how can you optimize better? So how can you learn faster? Because these models are really hard to optimize. And the first work that I did is together with Joshua, and just basically looking again at the natural gradient algorithm for deep networks. And this work was accepted at ICLR 2014. So I'm not going to go through this work, but I'm just going to say our main findings. So what we did is we presented natural gradient. So natural gradient is originally introduced based on information geometry, but we presented as a form of a trust region method, where we kind of extended the idea of a norm of the change to a distance between the previous position and the next position. Similar views are out there in the literature as well. Next, we made the connection between Hessian-free optimization and natural gradient. When you use a certain particular pairs of activation function and error function, it turns out that the Hessian-free can be seen exactly as natural gradient because of the kind of approximations that it makes. We looked at using the empirical Fisher instead of the true Fisher information matrix, which is a component of natural gradient, which is the work of, so Joshua and Nicolas Larue had a paper about it before, and they called this algorithm, also they called it Tonga. And we showed that basically using the empirical Fisher results in a different trust region method, so it's not exactly the same as natural gradient, it has different behavior during learning. Because natural gradient is a first order method, it can be accelerated using adding second order information of the error. So we showed this and we compared to some other results, some similar results in the literature. And then we showed how natural gradient can use unlabeled data to regularize learning, so basically behave better on the generalization error, which we really care about instead of the training error. And then natural gradient is also robust to the change in the order of the training set. Going on, still on the optimization side of things, we looked at the saddle points and what they mean for large non-convex optimizations, in particular deep learning for deep neural nets. So this is joint work with Leander Fan, Chalak, Kuyung, Surya Ganguly, and Joshua. And this is submitted at the news this year, and it's our revision. So the idea comes from statistical physics. They study the nature of critical points for random Gaussian fields, and what they find is this interesting property that if you have a sufficiently high dimensional problem, the critical points align on this line, where you have on one side the error that you get at this critical point, and yet on the other axis you have the index, which is the number of negative eigenvalues. So what this tells you is that exponentially many of all these critical points are actually saddle points instead of being local minima. And all the local minima are centered around the true minima of your problem. So this is one observation. So this is just a visualization. What they did is actually a theoretical proof of this property. And the other observation is that if you pick the Hessian at any of these critical points and then you plot the distribution of the eigenvalues, they turn out to follow this semicircular law where the semicircle is shifted according to the error that you get. So if your error is very small, it's shifted so much that basically all your eigenvalues are positive, and you have a local minima instead of having a saddle point. So this was an interesting observation because what they they basically said, they answered this old problem that people have when it comes to neural networks and non-convex optimization, which is you can never guarantee that you get close to the global minima. You always end up to a local minima, and that local minima can be arbitrarily bad. And the answer that they have is that if you have a sufficiently high-dimensional problem, this is not actually the case, because most of your critical points are settled points, and you don't have to stop there. And all your local minima are good enough. So the first thing that we wanted to do is we wanted to see if this is also true for neural networks. And of course we couldn't do this theoretically because it was a bit too complicated, so we started by first doing to get some empirical evidence. And what we did is we run small models, and then we checked every time the models seem to converge, we checked to see how many, we compute the true Hessian at that point and check how many negative eigenvalues we have and so on. So the first thing that we noticed is, if we look at the first plot, it looks, I guess, similar enough to the previous one to be encouraging. So it seems that it's true that there is a strong correlation between the error that you get and the number of negative eigenvalues that you have. And this is encouraging. If we look at the distribution of the eigenvalues, this is very different from what the theory predicted on this other functions. And, so this might be interesting because it might mean things are not exactly the same. So what we have is, we always have, so this is on the log scale compared to before. So now what happens now is, we always have a lot of eigenvalues that are very close to 0. But otherwise, the same is true. Depending on your training error, you have more eigenvalues be negative or not. So this is the empirical evidence. And then the next thing we went to is, well, we try to understand what some basic optimization algorithms do around settled points, and because most of these optimization algorithms, they're meant for the convex case, and they usually, when people implemented them, they usually were not thinking of how the algorithm behaves around the settled points. They were just worried of how it behaves in this convex wall. And in this plot, I just did like a toy depiction of what happens if you do HGD versus what happens if you do the Newton method, and then what you actually wanted to happen. So what happens if you do HGD, the gradient always points in the right direction, but as you're getting close to the settle point, the gradient becomes smaller and smaller, exponentially so. So you basically get stuck in this plateau where you're not making too much progress. Now, if you do the Newton method, what happens is also interesting. So the Newton method doesn't have this problem, or depending on how bad your higher order terms influence your function. But the Newton method doesn't really have this problem. It takes large steps towards your minima. But the problem is, as soon as you jump over your minima, if you overestimate it, as soon as you end up on the other side of the saddle, sorry, this is not the minima, this is a saddle. As soon as you're on the other side of your saddle, the Hessian will basically invert the direction of the gradient. And what that means is you're going to converge to the saddle point. So the saddle point becomes an attractor of the dynamics of learning. And what we want to do is we want to have the acceleration that's given by a second order method like the Newton method, but what we don't want to do is we don't want to invert the direction of the gradient. So we believe the direction of the gradient. We just use the curvature to tell us how fast we should move in this direction or another. And this is again some toy problems, and we played with Newton method and HGD and with the method that we proposed, and the behavior is kind of the way we expected it to be. So we tried to formalize the solution, and the solution itself of what we're proposing, which is down here, is not itself new. So there are people who proposed this before, but it was never formulated as an optimization problem. So this is what we try to do. So what we used the framework that we made for natural gradient of this generalized trust region method, and we tried to see if we can kind of tweak the how we construct our trust region such that we get the properties that we want. And it turns out that if what you're doing is you're doing this generalized trust region method where you're minimizing the first order Taylor of the function that you care about, but impose the trust region is given by fixing how different the second order Taylor of your function is from your first order Taylor of the function, and you apply Lagrange multiplier, and you need to do some approximations here. What you end up with a step that has this form, which is almost the same as the Newton step, with the difference that what you have to do is you have to take the Hessian, do an SVD, and then apply the absolute value to the eigenvalues of the Hessian. So you basically construct this matrix that I denoted here, that like the absolute Hessian, which is constructed from the Hessian by taking the absolute value of the Hessian. And the basic insight of this formulation is that the Hessian contains two information. So the first information is the norm of the eigenvalues, and the norm of the eigenvalues tells you how fast things are changing along the direction depicted by the eigenvector. So it's the curvature, it tells you how fast the error changes. And then you have the sign. And the sign is basically pointing you where the critical point, where is the most close critical point. And what you don't want to do is you don't want to use the sign, because the sign is pointing you towards the critical point but not necessarily towards the local minima, while the gradient is always pointing you towards the local minima. So what you want to do is you want to use a norm of the eigenvalues, which tells you how fast the function changes, and you want to use those to decide how much you want to move, but you somehow want to ignore the sign. Of course, this algorithm, the way it's written here, is not practical. It doesn't scale at all, because Hessians are too large, so you can't really even store them, let alone when SB decomposition, take the absolute value of the eigenvalue and decompose them, and then, oh, this was supposed to be an inverse here, so it's just a mistake. And then invert the whole thing, so it's just too expensive. And in my thesis, I didn't discuss how to fix this, but the idea would be that now we have something that we would want, and then the question is how we can approximate this to make it tractable. And in our NIRS paper, we actually did this by working in the Krylov subspace. So we projected everything down to a Krylov subspace, which was small enough, and then within this space, we compute the true Hessian, we do the SVD decomposition to take the absolute value, which works, but it's still not scalable enough for really high-dimensional problems. So there's still a lot of work to be done to actually get this method to work fast enough and not consume too much memory. So in the experiments that we did for this NIRS paper, we looked first at small models, and what we wanted to do is to get more evidence that when the model stops, usually it stops at the saddle point instead of a local minimum. And so first of all, what we see is that as you increase the number of hidden units, or you increase the dimensionality of your problem, our algorithm starts to do better, which is agreeing with this property of the theory, which says that it only holds in the limit when you have a lot of parameters, so as the problem becomes higher dimensional. So it's obvious the problem becomes higher dimensional, so our algorithm will do better, because it's more likely that you end up in a saddle point than a local minimum. And the other thing is we're looking at the most negative eigenvalue, and it's if you use a damped Newton method, so this would be like a standard trust reading method, or if you use mini-batch HGT, it turns out that the minima that you get after a sufficiently large amount of steps, this critical point that you get will basically have a lot more, the most negative eigenvalue is pretty large, so it's kind of an indicative that it's actually a saddle point and it's not a local minimum. While the most negative eigenvalue for when using our algorithm is much smaller, so it's an indicative that you probably you're not in a saddle, or maybe not the same. And this is using this Krylov subspace. We apply this for deep autoencoders and recurrent neural networks, and what we did here is we used mini-batch HGT until it felt like it converged, and then we reapplied our method starting from that point, and it usually gets you lower errors. So again, some evidence that the story we're trying to present holds. So this is all I wanted to say about optimization, and the last part of my thesis is looking at recurrent neural networks and looking at the question of memory, because we know that the reason a recurrent neural network is useful is exactly because it exhibits this memory, this working memory, and this is what makes it comparable to a Turing machine. So if we don't have memory in a recurrent net, it's basically useless to use a recurrent net. So the first work that I'll present is work that I've done with Professor Herbert Jäger, and this was submitted to and accepted to the Journal of Neural Networks. And I'm just going to have a slide on it. So basically what we wanted to do here is we wanted to show that recurrent nets can have memory. And the question that we're specifically looking at is what kind of memory this recurrent net can have. So there are many different mechanisms that can give you memory, but one could roughly separate them in two sets. On one set you have transient dynamics, And on the other set of memory mechanism, they use kind of an attractor-like mechanism. So in transient dynamics, it just means that depending on your input, you take a different trajectory through your space. But this trajectory is, if you add noise, you can diverge from it and you forget everything that you've remembered. So it's a very unstable kind of memory. While dynamics, what it means is if you could think of your recurrent neural network as some form of dynamical system, and that's kind of, so there are people working on formalizing this and making it more proper. But if you see your recurrent as a dynamical system, that one way of memorizing things is by using these attractors, and then basically your decoder is just looking to see in which basin of attraction I am. Am I closer to which attractor am I at this point? And the nice property of the attractor is that it basically, if you add noise, it doesn't really matter because you're going to stay within the basin of attraction and you're going to move to attractor. So attractor-like memory probably gives you a much more stable memory, but at the same time, it has its weakness. It has to be discrete because you have a finite number of attractors. So what we did in this work particularly, we wanted to see if recurrent net can have attractor-like memory. And for this, we kind of cheated. We've used an echo set network. We've added a special set of units which are supposed to be the memory units. And the way we cheated, we basically, during training, we told the model what it needs to memorize, for how long, and so on. And so we didn't care to see if we can train a model to do this. We're just cared to see if the model at the end can exhibit this behavior. So we provided all these hints during training, and then at the end, it actually learned to have this behavior. And in this plot, we show that basically, depending on which memory state you are, your whole model is kind of restricted to a subspace, sub-region of the space, which is probably the basin of attraction of those attractors. So this was encouraging, and on the next work that I did together with Thomas Mikalov and Joshua, was going one step further and then looking at how you would train a recurrent net and then asking a question about, is this trained recurrent net, can it exhibit memory or not? And this work was accepted at ICML 2013. The work, the way it starts is slightly different. It doesn't start from the question of memory, but it just starts from the question of how would you learn a recurrent net, and basically starts from two pathological behaviors that you see when you train a recurrent net. So the first one is the exploding gradient problem. So what happens is the gradient of recurrent net has this ugly form, and the only important bit of this ugly form is that you have a sum over things, and in this sum, each of the term is multiplied by a factor, which is a product of matrices. And then you can think of this product of matrices to behave exactly like a product of n numbers. If all the numbers are larger than 1, when you multiply them together, you get a number that grows exponentially fast. And this is basically the exploding gradient problem. What happens is you're training, and from time to time, you suddenly get gradients to be orders of magnitude larger than before, and this disrupts learning because you have a wrong learning rate and so on, and you're just not going the right way. So we tried to analyze this from different perspectives. I'm just going to present one of the perspectives, which I think is maybe the more interesting one. So what we try to do is also the most heuristic one. So what we try to do is we try to come up with a geometric interpretation of what's going on. And basically by looking at small models where we could actually visualize the error surface, and by basing our intuition on this dynamical systems, which I haven't presented, we end up with the conclusion that one possible way of seeing what happens is that you have this kind of cliff structure. So what this is different from the standard view is that it's not this nice valley. So usually when we think that we have pathological curvature and we have high curvature, the image that most people have in mind is this valley where in one direction you have high curvature and the other directions might have low curvature, and you kind of start from jumping from one side to the other side of the valley. So in our case, it's just like a one-sided valley if you want, and you just have this high wall of curvature. So then what happens is you're moving towards the wall, you hit the wall, and then you get a really high gradient. And then this view was interesting to us because it provided some more intuition of this generic trick that everybody does when training recurrent nets, which is just to clip the gradient of the norm. So as soon as the gradient becomes larger than some threshold that's set heuristically, you just fix the gradient norm to be that and continue. And that works very well in practice, but there is no proper justification of why you should do this from a population perspective. And our picture kind of gave a justification. So basically what happens is, if you clip your gradient and you take this step, you end up in the region where the gradient is better behaved, and then you take several steps which are going to move you again towards the wall, but it will also explore the other directions, and therefore you're going to make more progress towards your minima. So if you would have been here, this would not really work, because the reason why clipping works is you have this value on one side where you can take several steps until you reach the wall again, and while taking those steps you can consider other directions because the curvature is not that misbehaved. The other problem that people usually have when they're training recurrent nets is the vanishing gradient, which is a more subtle problem. So now what happens is, if you go back to the product of the set numbers, if all of the numbers are smaller than 1, if you multiply them together, they become 0. And this is more a subtle problem because it's true only for certain terms in this sum. So it's not like the norm of your gradient goes to 0, the norm of the gradient doesn't go to 0. It's just when, if you look at it as a sum, only some terms of those sum goes to 0. And those terms are actually the terms that are trying to learn correlation between events that are far away in time. Exactly the kind of things that you want to learn in the recurrent net. So basically learning this memory behavior of relating your target at time t with some fast input. Our solution, again, very pragmatic. We just add a regularization term. So when we minimize, instead of minimizing our normal cost, we add this term to the cost, which says that, well, in addition of minimizing this cost, what I want to do is I want the gradient of the cost up to some time k plus 1 to be the same as the norm of the gradient if you go one step back in time to k. So what they did is they take the norm of the gradients, the ratio of the norm of the gradients, and force it to be 1 using some square error. The way it's written here is untractable because it's very complicated to compute. So what I have to do is we have to do an approximation of this. So just realize that now you have to compute the gradient of this omega with respect to theta, your parameter, so that makes it really hard. So what we did is we basically consider these terms that are in green, we consider them to be constants, even though they are a function of theta. And we just do the gradients with the blue one, which is actually quite simple. We got something that's tractable, easy to, quite fast. It doesn't make HGD to be much slower. And then it kind of works. And to show it works, we started with some pathological problems for recurrence. So these are toy problems, but they've been used in the past to show that, to test how recurrence deal with memory. And I'm just going to show one of the tasks. So in this task, what happens, you have two important symbols, A and B, and then you have a lot of distractors, well, 4 distractor symbols, and then you get a sequence. And somewhere in the beginning of that sequence, you get one of the important symbols, and then somewhere in the middle of the sequence, you get the other one. And then at the end of the sequence, you have to predict in which order these symbols work, like A, B, B, A, or B, B. So it's obvious that in order to solve this task, you have to memorize what symbol is in here, and what symbol is in here, and then make a decision at the end. And somehow be robust to the noise given by these distractor symbols. So this is a toy problem. There are a bunch of others that are slightly more complicated. We managed to solve all of them, and we basically also, what we did is also looked at the effect of initialization. So this work is based on some intuitions of work from Delia and others, where they showed that if you initialize your recurrent network the right way, then you get better behavior in the end. So what we tried to do is we looked at the behavior when trying to solve this task. We looked at the behavior if we use a model that's badly initialized. In this case, you use sigmoid activation, which gets you much smaller gradients than usual, than 10H, which is the better choice. And we also use very small weights to initialize the model, which also kind of together this makes your vanishing gradient to happen very quickly. And then we checked, trying to solve this task for different sequence lengths, and we tried to do this with HGD plus clipping, and HGD plus our regularization term. And the HGD and HGD plus clipping, they don't help. You just cannot solve the task. If you add our regularization term, you can solve the task because the model is pushed towards this regime where it can remember things. Now, if you change your initialization and go towards a better initialization, you can see that you can start to solve this task even without our regularization term, which is agreeing with the results of EDR and all. And even better if you use, so this is the initialization they proposed. But still, for very long sequences, at one point this thing starts to fail while our regularization term keeps working. Oh, and the same thing is true if we, and then we try this on natural task, clipping always improved results, regularization term not always. The last work that we looked at, which is also accepted by ICLR 2014, it looks at deep recurrent neural networks and try to understand what deep recurrent networks are. So we made this basic observation that what people do usually when they construct deep recurrent nets is they just stack recurrent layers on top of each other. What we propose is just to make the transition between hidden layers to be deep in itself, because it might be, you could think of this process as just taking some input, the history, and try to add this input into the history, and this process is a very nonlinear one. So it's kind of unfair for us to ask like a simple formula of the recurrent net, which is just like it's even more shallow than a single MLP to be able to do this task. So we said we should make this deep, and we did some experiments and it kind of worked well. To summarize my contribution, we worked on showing why it's important to use deep network versus shallow ones. So and this is in line with other work that was done. We looked at the relationship between a few optimization techniques for deep learning, and then tried to look at trying to fit them together in this generalized trust region framework. We hypothesized that saddle points is the thing we probably care most about when we're trying to solve these high-dimensional complex problems, and we tried to propose an algorithm that does that. I looked at training SSA networks to exhibit memory, even though I was cheating during training. The question was, can it exhibit this kind of memory? And the answer was yes. Then we kind of, using some heuristic solutions, we find better training for recurrent networks, which seem to do much better on this memory testing now with these heuristics. And then the last thing we looked at is what is the meaning of that for recurrent neural networks. So yes, so how can you construct recurrent nets in terms of the different orthogonal mechanisms that you can use to get that.